I had lots of leftover pressure-treated shiplap cladding from the build of my workshop, and I really don't have much space in the shop to store wood, so I decided to use it up and make something useful out of it. After measuring up what lengths of the cladding I had available, along with all of the salvaged wood that I've found over time in skips, near bins and discarded in alleyways, I figured I'd have enough to build a doghouse. So I started by milling some timber on the table saw. I ripped an old 2x6 plank of wood in half, and then ripped each half into strips that I could use to build the frame. For the base of the frame, I wanted to use pressure treated wood, so I ripped off the shiplap edges off a few lengths of the cladding, and then cut them to length on the miter saw. Then I screwed the pieces together to form what would become the bottom panel of the doghouse. I applied glue and then put one screw in each corner, and then used a framing square before screwing in the second screw on each corner to make sure that everything was square. I then measured the bottom panel from corner to corner, and the measurements were equal, which meant that the frame was perfectly square. Then I took another 2x6 plank which I could use to make the uprights for the frame. I cut it roughly in half on the miter saw, and then cut the two pieces to the same length, and then ripped the pieces into strips on the table saw. I then marked up where I wanted to cut a joint in the uprights, which would be a half lap joint for added strength. I cut these on the bandsaw. Then I glued and screwed the uprights to the bottom panel. Next, to keep the uprights square, I decided to fit the cladding to the rear panel, so I set up a stop block on the miter station and cut the cladding to length. To fit the cladding, I drilled one pilot hole and used a countersink bit in the centre of the cladding at each end, and then screwed it to the frame. This should allow for movement of the wood as the seasons change, and drilling the pilot hole should prevent the wood from splitting over time. I completed the frame by adding braces to join the front and back panels, with more half lap joints cut on the bandsaw. These were glued and screwed into place. Then I cut one more piece for the frame to complete the front panel. Then I ripped the edges off more of the shiplap cladding to form a door frame. I cut them to height on the miter saw, positioned them using a tape measure to get each side equal, and then glued and screwed. I set up a stop block on my table saw crosscut sled and cut some small offcuts of cladding to fit between the doorway and the sides. And then fitted these to the front panel. To create the top of the doorway, I used a piece of cladding long enough to stretch all the way across the front panel. I chopped it to length on the miter saw. Then I marked up where I could cut a curve. I did this freehand. And then I cut it out on the jigsaw. Then I used my orbital sander to round over the corners to the entrance. To create an A-frame roof, I milled some more timber on the table saw and then cut the ends to a 22.5 angle on the miter saw. I used some small scraps of plywood to create a brace to join the two angled ends together. I marked a centre point, placed the two ends together, traced around the top, marked up the shape I wanted the brace to be, and then cut it out on the bandsaw and the table saw. Then I glued and screwed the brace to the two angled pieces, and this created a really rigid, strong A-frame shape that would support the roof. I placed the A-frame on top of the doghouse, centred it using a tape measure, and then marked up where the side panels met the A-frame using a speed square as a guide, and then used a straight edge to join the two marks. Then I cut out the notches with a jigsaw so that the A-frame would sit nicely on top of the side panels. Before fitting the first piece of the A-frame, I cut the same 22.5 angle on each end and then screwed it directly onto the frame. And later on I fitted two more of these A-frames made in exactly the same way to support the roof. I fitted the rest of the cladding pieces to the front panel. I could just trace the shape out and then cut it out on the bandsaw for a perfect fit. Then it was time to make some cladding uprights to hide the end grain of the shiplap and protect it from the weather. So I used more of the shiplap cladding, this time ripped down to strips of about 1 inch wide. I marked up the angles and cuts that I'd need to make with a pencil and then cut them out using a bandsaw and also a handsaw. I drilled pilot holes and then nailed them in place. I did this to each of the 4 corners. Then I cut more shiplap to length to clad the side panels. To fit the top piece of cladding around the roof rafters, I marked up where I could cut some more notches with the jigsaw. It took a few attempts to get the notches to the right size. And I used a hammer to persuade it into place. Then I realised that the top of the shiplap cladding was actually higher than the roof rafters, so I ripped it down on the table saw by about 1 centimetre and then refitted it. Then I turned the whole structure over, realising it was quite heavy by this point, and added another piece of shiplap to the bottom panel to support where the floorboards would go. So I glued and screwed that into place. I decided to use pallet wood to make the floorboards, as they wouldn't be exposed to the weather. Before fitting the pallet wood floorboards, I gave each piece a treatment of wood preserver, mainly to protect it from boring insects, but also from any rising damp that may occur. I measured up the overall depth of the doghouse and cut all the pallet slats to length. Then I cut out more notches on the bandsaw so that they would all fit into place. I did a dry fit and then glued and nailed all of the floorboards to the floor supports. Then I gave the whole floor a good sanding, as the pallet wood was rough sawn and I wouldn't want any dog who uses the doghouse to get a splinter in his or her paw. Then I added the rest of the cladding. To tidy up the entrance, I decided to make a nice doorstep to protect the end grain of the pallet wood floorboards. So I ripped down some more shiplap. I cut a doorstep support piece to size and screwed this to the front. Then I cut another piece of cladding and shaped it first on the bandsaw. Then I rounded the edges on the belt sander. And that was ready to fit. I think it looked much better with a doorstep. I then cut some material to use for the roof. I had some 3/4 inch pressure treated particle board, but not enough to do the whole roof. But I did have some 3/4 inch plywood to make the rest of it. It doesn't really matter that the two pieces don't match, as they would eventually be covered in roofing felt anyway. I cut the particle board to size on the table saw. I made sure I cut it so that there would be a slight overhang over the sides to cover the roof rafters. Then I tilted the table saw blade to the 22.5 degree angle that I'd used to form the A-frame for the roof, to cut the second sheet so that it would meet the first sheet without leaving a gap between the two panels at the top. I drilled pilot holes and then screwed the roof panels into the roof rafters. I was a bit worried about the roofing felt being put onto what seemed to be quite a sharp edge at the top of the roof, so I carved away at it with a craft knife just to round over the corners a bit and then sanded it down. I laid the roofing felt on top and used an old handsaw to trim the edges. I'm sure there's a better way to cut this stuff to size, but this worked for me. I ripped some more 1-inch strips of cladding to use as a trim for the roof. For the front and back, I cut them to size with the 22.5 degree angle again and fitted by drilling a pilot hole and nailing into the roof boards. I used a craft knife to trim the excess roof felt. Then I applied a trim to the side of the roof in the same way as I had done for the front and back. That should have been the project complete. However, when I got the doghouse outside, I realised that I didn't like the way that the trim looked on the roof, as the end grain from the pieces of trim at the side of the roof were visible from the front. So I used a hammer and screwdriver to remove the trim. Cut the side trim flush with the front of the roof using a handsaw, and then fitted new longer trim pieces to both the front and the back of the roof, and I was much happier with the way that that looked. That's the doghouse completed. Unfortunately, I don't have a dog to keep in it, and it's a bit too big for my cat, so this item is available for sale from my eBay store. I've included a link to the auction in the description box below the video if you're interested in buying it. and just before selling it I thought that I should give it a test run and try it out for myself.
Me? I made the slide. You made it, did you? Alright. I didn't go on it. I saw the water.
Thanks for watching.